The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning. Welcome. We are so glad to have all of you here today for this discussion on diversity, inclusion, and integration. It is 10:01, so we'll give it another minute before we start the content. But as we get started, we just want to say thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. This has been a hard few days in the city of Atlanta. As many of you know, Congressman John Lewis has represented the city of Atlanta since 1986, and so all of our staff has really taken hard his loss and his passing, but we've also used it to instill in us a commitment to these issues. And his spirit, I know, is with me today as I speak with y'all, and I hope also with everyone here. I think of him now as a guardian angel for SEEA and for myself on this journey of diversity, integration, and inclusion. And so now that we are at 10:02, we will go ahead and get started. So again, thank you all. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you here with us today for the next 90 minutes. I am Mandy Mahoney. It is my honor to serve as the president of the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. And this journey comes to me on diversity, integration, and inclusion from my childhood. I grew up in the deep south of Macon, Georgia. And Macon exemplifies all the things not to do when it comes to dealing with race relations. In the 1960s, the police chief kept peace by arming the police officers with machine guns. Macon waited to desegregate until the last day allowable by federal law in 1973. And growing up, I heard and experienced a tremendous amount of racist content from people in my life, friends' parents, my parents' friends, and just people in the community. But I was very fortunate to go to the Catholic school, and it was the only school in Macon that was not a segregation academy, that was not established in 1973 for white people to have somewhere to flee to from the newly integrated public schools. And I was educated by nuns, the Sisters of Mercy. They had started the school decades before as a mission school, actually, to deal with to address civil rights. And the nuns from first grade on, Sister Bernarda, instilled in us the seeds of social justice. And as I grew up in Macon, those seeds continued to grow and flourish. And I can remember very distinctly in middle school thinking about social justice, civil rights, and access to natural resources. I believe that we must all have a right and access to water, clean air, energy, and that's what led my professional path to this day to SEEA and what I studied in school and in graduate school. And it's been a really joyful journey to be able to be with the board and staff as we have explored how to lean in and do this work and hold the space for growth as we do the work in the Deep South. So Pam, next slide. So today we have a group of folks that we've been leaning in, doing hard work together, and we are all so excited to share our journey. We do this because we want to model what has worked for us. Each group and individual will have their own journey, but we believe it's important to share what's worked and also what hasn't worked at SEEA. So John Silkey is our board chair. Mitchell Simpson is our board vice chair. Pam Ban is our director of membership services and is also a certified cultural diversity professional and trainer. And Wesley is our director of strategy and development and leads our strategic planning initiative. Each of us will speak to you about different elements that we've led and managed on this journey. Next slide. We've intentionally defined diversity, inclusion, and integration. We actually went through a formal process to even figure out what we wanted to call it. And we decided diversity and integration, and inclusion and integration, each of those words meant something to us as a staff and a board, and that we wanted to call each one out separately. We had the most discussion actually about integration, because that does connote a significant amount of emotion in the South. And we all know about the spilled blood that has happened in the name of integration. But that was even more a reason that we thought it was important to use it. Next slide. And so again, today, we are sharing this simply because we think it's important for us all to be in community and talk about what we're doing. We're reading a lot of articles, we're watching a lot of videos, we're reading a lot of books, but we also must move into the phase of discussion and sharing so that we can move out of the intellectualization of what we're consuming and into the pragmatic action. And that is what, again, makes me think of John Lewis. John Lewis spoke of good trouble. And, you know, that is what we affectionately are thinking about as we do our planning at SEEA. And so today we'll walk through how we've developed a culture of trust, the commitment we've established over years at the board level, where our planning and resources are, and how we're integrating diversity, integration, and inclusion into every single aspect of the work that we do. Next slide, please. So first, developing the culture of trust. This is our team. I've been at SEEA now for about 10 years. I spoke to you about my personal journey of experiencing racism growing up as a child. And deeply in my soul, I have also wanted to create safe spaces, safe, inclusive spaces. I saw racism firsthand. I also experienced gender discrimination. And I got thinking early in my life about how if I felt that way, how I felt put down as a woman with all of the access and privilege that I had, I could only imagine how it must feel to be a Black person in the Deep South. And so I have personally worked very hard to support Black people from the South being invited, included, welcomed into the environmental community and the energy and the climate community, because we are such a white group of people. And I think you can see that reflected in our staff. We have intentionally gone out and recruited from the historically Black colleges and universities. We're fortunate that we have quite a few of them here in Atlanta at the Atlanta University Center. Pam herself is a Clark graduate of the AUC, and that has been a wonderful resource for us. And as we have been able to build the staff, we get the feedback that when applicants are looking to come to SEEA, they see on the website that we do have a true diversity of race on our staff, that's a very attractive thing. And we know the data says that when millennials are looking for a job, but we've also been given that feedback directly. And I find that really reaffirming. We still have a long way to go, but I'm proud of this piece of our journey. Next. The culture of trust has been something we have been working on in parallel to our journey around diversity, inclusion, and integration. I believe that everyone has equal value and gifts that they bring to the organization. And to seek that out and create space for someone who's new to the organization to be able to give feedback to me that something didn't work or they need something more of me, we've had to be very purposeful in dismantling the typical hierarchical structures that prevent open and honest dialogue and feedback. And so we've done that by creating a formal meeting culture where we have processes that we've put in place with the help of an outstanding consultant, so that we can hear all voices and appreciate all points of view in our meetings. We also have a robust culture of giving and receiving feedback. We have agreements on how we give and receive feedback so that people can receive it and also people can feel comfortable giving it. But also we have twice a year, we give peer feedback in formal processes as part of our performance development process. And when we do our performance reviews twice a year, it's a critical part of people's growth. And what I love is that each time we spice up and change up who is giving that feedback. And I love when I am asked to give feedback and when I'm also able to seek it out, because I think that that is a signal that people are willing and comfortable to hearing various points of view about their journey in work. And then again, the meeting designs, really pushing ourselves to figure out how to create space so that all voices are heard. That has served us very well in the pandemic. Already having those practices in place, we were able to pivot very quickly into being responsive. And it's also manifested in terms of this discussion today, diversity, integration, and inclusion. I don't think we could have had the kind of discussions that Pam will speak to later if we didn't already have a really robust culture of trust. People knew, everyone on staff knew that all meetings are safe spaces and that they could say what they needed to say as we got into discussing hard things like the murder of Ahmaud Arbery that happened here in Georgia in February. Next. A critical part of our work that manifests internally as externally is looking at these three layers. So self, other, and system. We think that we all have to do the work first. We have to look inside ourselves on all of the things if we are going to be able to manifest externally the work that we want to see changed. I can share my own journal or my own journey that has meant reading most recently books like White Fragility, as well as How to Be an Anti-Racist. And then taking the prompting questions in that and being real honest with myself about how I have manifested racist behavior in the past, but then being able to have the safe space within the organization to share that and shed that, it has been freeing to do. And I'm deeply thankful for that. And the other element, it's thinking about how to give and receive feedback, how to ask others what they need more of from me, or how to ask others what more I can do for them. And that typically manifests within the staff, but we also think about it as we work with stakeholders, whether it be Mitchell and John on the board or people externally, like what is it that they're going to need from me so that this relationship can be successful? And then finally, what is that layer about what we want to manifest as an organization that's going to get us to achieve our mission? And as we hold all three of those things in parallel to work on them, we're able to detangle a lot of the gnarly emotion and multi-layers of history and current day facts that can be conflated, and that if we conflate them, we're not able to be really laser focused and almost surgical in the work we do. But by detangling them, by talking about self, other, and system, we are able to be really purposeful and intentional about the highest and best use of a conversation, of a meeting, of an email. And we know that conversations around DI&I carry a lot of emotion and that words matter. So the more pre-work we can do to ensure that when we do want to have that conversation, that it's the best possible conversation we can have, that is going to create and build and maintain trust so that we can go deeper and do harder work. Next. It is my pleasure, it is my joy, it is with so much excitement now that I'm going to turn this over to our board chair and vice chair. It has just been amazing to be on the journey with them. And I also have to recognize our immediate past board chair, Steve Leeds. Steve Leeds summoned all of us on the board and staff to be committed to work around diversity and integration and inclusion, and to address it in all of our work and at all of our board meetings. And I'm sure he's listening today, so thank you, Steve. And you've laid a great foundation for us. And John, I'll turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Mandy. And just a quick audio check that you can hear me clearly. Great. Not surprisingly, I started off this meeting with severe audio issues. Good morning, everyone. I will echo what Mandy said. Appreciate you joining us. This is obviously a timely and much needed conversation that is now thankfully continuing as opposed to just waiting to be started, thanks to the just incredible activism that kicked off these past few months and continues around the world. I'm going to share a sort of a personal story and personal journey of this experience with SEEA. And as chair of the board, I think it will help illustrate some of the things I've learned along this path. And then we can get a little bit into sort of the mechanics and the how of what we did as a board on this DII journey. About 3-ish years ago, and I lose the timeline a little bit, as Mandy mentioned, Steve Leeds was our board chair and really led us in beginning this intentional look at ourselves as a board. We were predominantly white, predominantly male, and we just kind of looked around the room and everyone looked like me for the most part. And we decided that this needed to change. This wasn't representative of the region we are supposed to represent as SEEA. And so we went about starting to obviously measure what we looked like, but really discussing what does DII mean for us? What do these words actually mean? And if we're going to change, how do we go about changing? And changing the look of the room in which we sit and changing the perspectives that we're bringing to the table. Part of that journey was taking advantage of new board members. Every year we have some number of new board seats, or excuse me, board seats that are vacated because people are rolling off or do not renew. And 2 years ago, we were blessed with about 6 or 7 board seats that were empty. And so we decided as a board, let's take advantage of this and let's really be intentional in who we recruit. If we're really serious about increasing our diversity, we have to set a direction and go talk to people that we haven't talked to before. And so we committed as a board to really go out and find who would be a great board candidate and who would also increase how we define diversity, which we'll see in a little bit later. It can include race, it can include gender, it can include geography, it can include industry. But obviously we were much more focused on race and gender at the time, given our current makeup at the time. And I was personally really, really excited about this. But inside, I had this voice, this story saying, this is great, but I don't think there will be that many candidates that will fit what we need. And I'm going to pause there and travel back in my history a little bit. I grew up in a predominantly white suburb, in a predominantly white school in upstate New York, in a city that today remains physically segregated. My school was all white teachers. Someone recently asked me, when was the first non-white teacher that you had? It was my freshman year in college, and only because I took a course called The History of African American Literature. So until I was 18, I never had a non-white teacher. I went to a private college with almost zero interaction with people of color. I think at the time we were 87% white. So my network was built on this foundation. And if I'm honest, I look back now and I can see I probably actively avoided opportunities to break out and interact with people of color. So if we come back to my time on the board and our efforts going out and recruiting new board members, this was the story I was telling myself. But here's what we found. For those open seats, we received 10 applications. Only one of those was a white male. Really quickly, I saw I had taken my past experience and my network and I had projected it onto an entire industry and region. And it was in that moment I realized, oh, my story is not the story, and that I needed to separate myself from that and start thinking differently. This has been an incredible addition to our culture as a board, and the folks that we brought on as new board members have been a fantastic addition. I can talk about how it increases perspectives. I think the buzz phrase right now is cognitive diversity. But really, at the end of the day, if you're a homogenous group, you have blind spots that are huge risks because you don't have all of the right people at the table. Or if you haven't, as Maddie said, created a culture of safety, you may have some folks at the table who feel like they have to hide parts of themselves or conform in order to be safe, and therefore you're still missing that perspective, even though it's sitting right at the table. And fundamentally, big thing I've learned really these past couple months is that yes, all people deserve an actual equal opportunity, but what I've learned is that requires more than just making sure the doors aren't closed. We have to actively open them and invite new people in. And I've been taking these learnings and this kind of new awareness into my own company and some of the work we are now tackling, because not surprisingly, I come from a company that also looks just a lot like me. And we looked around and said, this can't remain this way. Next slide, please. So more the mechanics of how we did this as a board, as I mentioned, we had some really frank and honest discussions. And a big part of that is Mandy had helped us cultivate a culture of safety where we could have these conversations. And we just discussed over several meetings, what is diversity for us? Why does it matter for us as a board with our role in the organization of SEEA? And we set about, defining those words, and as Mandy mentioned, teasing out a lot of the nuance and being really clear on what words work, because language matters. And then we just set a very clear intention that we are going to go out and find folks that fit what it is we now know we need. I realized this wasn't a field of dreams situation. It wasn't if we build it, they will come. That we had to go out and be active and talk to people we hadn't talked to before. Talk to people that may have looked at the photos of the board and said, that's not for me. I don't feel welcome there. And maybe they weren't even applying for these board seats in years past. So it was really key to get beyond my network and social circle and to meet folks, whether it was at the conference or at other industry events that I hadn't met before and maybe had resisted meeting. Next slide, please. We laid out essentially, in addition to the criteria we had for new board members, we included very explicitly diversity. So a number of these things were laid out previously in our bylaws and some of our kind of just unspoken practices. And we said, no, this needs to stand up beside these other criteria that have existed for a while now. We were very clear. We said this isn't in lieu of other criteria, other markers that we need in successful candidates. But we also were very clear that it's a critical piece that as we're evaluating potential new board members, we need to consider this. Because again, we need to create broader perspectives, fill our blind spots on this board, and make it a more welcoming place. Next slide, please. As we'll see on these next 3 slides, here are our numbers. We know we still have a way to go. We know we are still predominantly male. Next slide, please. And we are still predominantly white. And yes, I can hang my hat on that progress over the past 4 years, but I understand that it's not enough. We are still not representative of the region or the communities that we live and work in. And next slide, please, Pam. And that, as I mentioned, we also look at geography and sector. So we try to balance. We have added new corporate board members, so non-utility members, and within the utility sector, 7 of these are large or IOUs, and the other 5 are co-ops. And we also have nonprofits represented. So we understand we need different industries as well, but within those, can we find a more diverse candidate set? We know we have more work to do, but we put ourselves on the path, and more importantly, created momentum and a cultural commitment to keep us going. And so I'm really excited that as the board turns over, that momentum and commitment is going to continue. And I know that as a board, we are so much better for it, so much better for it. And that I can't wait to see the new folks that come on in the coming years and the new ideas for SEEA that arise from it. And with that, I will turn it back to Pam in control and our board vice chair, Mitchell Simpson.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Sound check, can everyone hear me okay? Great. So Mitchell Simpson at the Department of Energy and Environment here in Arkansas. And so thanks again, as Mandy and John have shared, for taking the time to participate in this discussion today. As John said, as SEEA as an organization has made a lot of progress in terms of reaching or pursuing diversity. And in order to continue that work or support the continuation of that work and capitalize on the momentum that we've developed and continue that, the board as a whole thought that it might be important to develop or create some infrastructure to support that. And so we opted to do that by developing a subcommittee, a board diversity subcommittee. As a note, just to sort of address why I think this sort of work is extremely important. I think one, because it's difficult to have these conversations for everyone who's involved. But I think the more that we have these conversations, the easier it becomes and the better we become as people, as organizations, as societies. Another reason is because I think whether we know it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, we all operate with some degrees of bias. Whether those biases are severe or subtle, they should be acknowledged, because only then can we properly address them. I mean, think about it. Have you ever found yourself unable to tell the difference between 2 people of another race? Or has someone had to shorten their name because it's an unfamiliar name to you in order for you to be able to pronounce it because you didn't take the time to actually learn it? Or do you use phrases that seem harmless, such as the natives are getting restless, without really considering the origin of those phrases? I think having these diversity conversations sort of help illuminate those sort of biases that we harbor within ourselves that we may or may not be aware of. And we have to be unafraid to address them, I think. Another reason is because I truly believe that our relationships, communities, organizations, and societies become better and stronger when we have diversity, integration, and inclusion of different ideas and thoughts. And then finally, I would say, I think it's important because these conversations allow us to bring our whole selves to the work and the experience. And when we bring our whole selves, that means we bring our whole backgrounds, we bring our whole strengths, we bring our whole intentions. And what we end up creating is a complicated but rich collection of, I think, useful and creative ideas. So in terms of the organization, as we started to move forward, to look at what the work that we wanted this this subcommittee to do. We solicited volunteers, and as you see from the slide there, we have 6 volunteer board members from nominates and governance who decided to make a commitment to pursue this work or to support this work. These folks take on this particular challenge. As I mentioned, they do it voluntarily, but they volunteer because they're passionate and committed to creating the change that they wish to see around diversity, inclusion, and integration. They made it a point to take something that is seemingly unnecessary and have chosen to uncover it to highlight the true necessity, value, and benefit of it. Also, I think it's important to mention that one of the initial charges of the subcommittee, as Mandy and John have shared, is that it was centered on racial and gender diversity of the board. But the committee decided that there was a need to go deeper, and they also wanted to develop a more robust board policy to support this work. So the committee expanded, as John's already mentioned, its scope to include geography and years of experience. And in terms of inclusion and integration, we realized that it wasn't enough just to have diversity. Because diversity, for example, is just sort of adding different races or genders to the meeting, which is different from inclusion, which is inviting the input of those different races and genders into the discussion, which is different from integration, which is actually incorporating the input of those ideas into the creation of the product that's being developed. This expansion, if you will, really led us to more comprehensive consideration of our work. As we continued, we started to see that there was some more interest in seeing diversity, inclusion, and integration into our strategic plan. As we try to lay out a strategy, I think, that will help us become agile and resilient enough to weather the unknowns of tomorrow, I think we have to build in the ability to flex and adapt to sudden or unexpected changing conditions. And we can only do that when we put ourselves in position to access and pull from experiences, creativity, and the input of a broadly diverse team. And then the last bullet that you'll see there on the slide, we, in terms of the board thought that the work that we were doing would help us align on integration. So we wanted to name integration. We wanted to specifically focus on a DII strategy, and we wanted to craft a statement and president's message, which you'll see on the next slide. But here, I think it was important to point out that it's easy to overlook or dismiss the importance of diversity, inclusion, and integration. But a mission or a strategy that doesn't include considerations, I think, of the broader society or situation in which we operate will undoubtedly come up short. That's not to say that focusing on DII will solve all of our problems, but it will certainly help us identify problems that may have otherwise been overlooked. And not missing those problems could significantly influence whether or not we see success or failure. Next slide, please. So here, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, the subcommittee developed, in partnership with the rest of the board and the staff, this headline statement. And so as you see it there, it's a continuous commitment to diversity and inclusion in the Southeast. The Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance is committed to creating opportunities for diversity, inclusion, and integration across race, gender, age, religion, identity, and experience to generate more equitable outcomes. That headline statement was a labor of love, but we knew that it was important in order to communicate as this organization continues to move and be in the atmosphere. We knew it was important that we showed up with that intention front and center, so that our partners and folks in the community would know what, as I mentioned earlier, our intentions were or are. Next slide, please. And then we thought it was important to develop a president's message. So as the president of the organization, Mandy goes out and talks with donors or partners or what have you, we thought it was important that we develop a message that she can clearly communicate sort of the goals and intentions of SEEA. So as you see there through the message, it points out how we value people, places, and cultures in the Southeast. We value race and gender and age and religion, as I mentioned earlier, and we're committed to diversity, inclusion, and integration. We welcome diverse backgrounds and experiences, as John mentioned earlier. And as I said just a few moments ago, because we believe that it does create a stronger team. And it enables us, as you see in that last line of the second paragraph, to transcend perceived differences as we engage with the members and the communities that we support, because we truly recognize that I think, as we all have heard, and we all, I think, inherently realize that we have much more in common than we think. And so we intentionally chose the phrase perceived differences. But our objective, as you see there from the last sentence or last paragraph there, is that everyone will have the opportunity to develop and achieve their full potential and contribute to their unique perspectives to support SEEA's mission. And we believe that this collaborative thinking develops greater levels of trust and generates more equitable outcomes for all. So thanks. I'll pause there, and I think I'll transition it on over.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Sure.
My name is Pamela Fan. I am the Director of Member Services for SEEA, and I'm also a Certified Cultural Diversity Professional and Trainer. How all of this started for me in thinking about diversity inclusion, my experience is somewhat similar to John's growing up. I too grew up in an all-white community. My family, we were the first Black people to integrate a community in Owasso, Oklahoma. I had actually no Black teachers throughout elementary through high school, or coaches, or in our town, actually, there were no Black store clerks, bankers, none of that. So I share some of those experiences that John did. On the flip side of that, I left Owasso, Oklahoma once I graduated and went to an all-Black college. So as we were talking, Mitchell mentioned earlier about we were thinking about how we wanted to term diversity, inclusion, and integration. Belonging is one of those words that many people incorporate into their diversity strategy. So it's diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but belonging never felt right to me. I personally just never felt as if I belonged anywhere. Having grown up where I grew up and then transitioning and going to an all-Black college, I didn't belong there either. I didn't fit in. My vernacular was different. My dress was different. And so I didn't really belong there either. So that integration piece was really important. And I know that we all as the board and the subcommittee kind of struggled over that word, but most of us, I think, aligned more succinctly with that word. So just to give you a little background on that. So I've been with SEEA about 2.5 years now. And in coming to SEEA and recognizing how SEEA was a very inclusive organization, I travel a lot for my role, and being out in the field, I noticed that it wasn't a diverse field. Sometimes I would attend conferences or events, and I am the only person who looks like me there. After a few months, I recognized that, this seems to be a problem. And so having a little bit, just giving a little bit of background, I came to SEEA from the Coca-Cola company, where I spent 22 years. 7 of those years, I worked on a diversity board. And I also worked very closely with our Office of Diversity. So as I'm out in the field and I'm noticing these things and I'm seeing the lack of, I took that to Mandy and I said, what is the issue with diversity in this industry? And she, said, yeah, it's a problem, and it's something that we as an organization have been working on, but it's definitely an issue within the industry. And I said, I'd like to help with that. in whatever way that I can, having my past experience. So a few months later, our 2018 SEEA conference was happening, and I asked if I could put together a diversity panel. So I did. I put together a panel, The Value of Cultivating Diversity and Inclusion in Energy. The panel itself was top women leaders, multicultural, from different corporate and energy organizations who spoke to the value of diversity, and it went overwhelmingly well. And made me think, like, you know, there is a time and place for this, and this is the time for it. And people were open to engaging in those conversations. And from there, I started having follow-up conversations and education around diversity with other organizations. And towards the end of the year, I said, you know what, maybe I should just get certified in doing this work, since I'm talking about it more and doing more. And plus, you know, in addition to that, just wanting to learn how to talk about it in different ways. So in 2019, early 2019, I went and got certified as a cultural diversity professional and trainer. And during that training, there were some things that I learned and some things that I brought back. And I said, you know, I came back to Mandy and I said, we have to be an example of what we want to model in the industry. And I think that it's important that we not only state it in a message, which, as mentioned earlier, our headline statement and president's message, but we also put together a strategy of how we're going to do it ourselves. So that's what I began working on in 2019, was putting together that strategy. That was in addition to that, in 2019, we had our 2019 conference, where we incorporated and infused a lot of diversity into that conference. And if any of you on the call remember that conference, I'm sure you know, just by visual representation, but also in the way that we were having discussions. We wanted to make sure that we wove in diversity across the board within that. I wanted to show this picture here because it was very important to me to show and talk about the culture at SEEA. So again, coming to SEEA celebrated diversity, and how I knew that, my first week at SEEA, we actually attended and participated in the MLK 50 March for Humanity, which was done on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Imagine coming into an organization and immediately your first couple of days, people are saying, oh, we're preparing for this march. We're making signs. We also put together a unity wreath to present to the family. And that was very heartwarming to me to understand and to know that this is the culture of an organization that I want to be a part of. Mandy mentioned earlier, you know, our team, and if you saw the visual representation of our team, anyone seeing that and noticing that on our website would make a decision on employment or doing business with if they note that you are a diverse organization. It's very important for organizations nowadays to not only talk about representation or talk about diversity, but to also exemplify that in the way that they're promoting themselves. So we talk the talk and walk the walk in this way. But yeah, I just wanted to show this picture because it was, again, my first week on the job. I'm attending a march for humanity for Dr. King. And I think that was just important to help you to understand what kind of organization that SEEA is. And talking a little bit about the diversity, inclusion, and integration strategy, there are several phases that go into putting together an approach to create a strategic plan for DI&I. Recruiting the diversity subcommittee, this first phase is really the most important phase, your board subcommittee. So if your board is in alignment with ensuring that you want to create diversity amongst your board members, that subcommittee part, you have to have someone intentionally working on it. That means someone that's intentionally looking at your networks, someone who is intentionally talking about how the organization aligns with diversity. So that subcommittee part is very important. So, you know, thanks to Mitchell and the team, the subcommittee team, for having that in place. So when I did go to Mandy and mention to her about us doing this work, we already had a subcommittee in place. So we didn't have to go back and do that step. So that already showed me that SEEA was on the right path. Holding an alignment meeting with the subcommittee, determining capacity to work on initiatives, aligning on the purpose and goals, developing the initiative and the vision statement, which Mitchell read earlier, and then communicating the vision and strategy to key stakeholders, which is something that we did at our conference. So the president's statement, for some of you who attended our conference at the end of 2019, that was something that we released there for all of you to be able to see. And, you know, Mandy got up and spoke to that. So, you know, just to show our commitment to our stakeholders. There are several other phases that follow. Phase 2 is an assessment phase, which we did a needs assessment from our team, our staff, as well as from our board. Internal needs assessments are good for a couple of things, that they help you gauge the temperature of how your employees are feeling, to understand if they know that equal pay is happening, to understand if they feel valued at work. So we did some of those needs assessments, and there are needs assessments that address your internal processes, and there's also needs assessments that address your cultural diversity within an organization. So we are, the analysis phase, phase 3 is complete as well, and we will be in the process of reviewing all of those gaps that we have as an organization, whether they be the cultural gaps or the organization gaps. And again, some of your organization gaps may be looking at your pay and ensuring that men or women are fairly paid against women, that people of color are fairly paid against white people. So it may take some evaluating of those things, that your policies are in place to support all of your employees. If you have lactating mothers, that you have policies in place for them to be able to do that safely and discreetly. If you have transgender employees, that you have unisex bathrooms to be able to accommodate their needs. So there's several things there that should be all-encompassing of policies. Another important one is paternity leave. Paternity leave is really important. Mothers nowadays are going back to work. Fathers share the responsibility in raising kids, or if you have same-sex partnerships. So reviewing your policies, that's a big part of this assessment and analysis phase. So those are complete for us, and we are currently looking at going into phase 4, which is development. And this is designing training for our teams to be able to become more culturally sound. And that when Mandy mentioned the self-other system part of what we do, this is the self part. This is understanding that that you as a person have that cultural awareness, and that you know how to combat those unconscious biases that we all have. Mitchell mentioned that earlier. We all have those biases, but this is the part that helps you combat that. So looking really forward to participating in that training and leading that training. Phase 5 is the implementation and rollout of the training. We're looking to start that in August. And then phase 6 is consistent evaluation and maintenance. So you want to make sure that whatever goals that you align on, or whatever comes out of your assessment and analysis, that you're evaluating that every 3 to 6 months, that you're looking at that and ensuring that you're following up, and that these are measurable things that you can attest to. In order to make it stick, it has to be measurable. So that's your other part of the phase. 2020 presented some challenges for us. As I mentioned and just showed you the timeline for some of this work that we're doing, we're behind schedule. Not surprisingly, but 2019, in all honesty, took majority of that time took the phase one approach. That is your most important phase, and you want to make sure that you're doing everything to get that right. So my timeline was a little askew, but that phase was just so important to us that we took more time to ensure that we got that right. As 2020 kicked off, as we were preparing to finish up our assessments and doing the analysis part, COVID happened. We were all then sent home, began teleworking, and it became a new normal for a lot of us. And many of us had to get adjusted to working from home, not only working from home, but working from home with our partners or husbands or wives and with our children and educating them as well. So we kind of pumped the brakes a little bit on the D&I work. With the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the subsequent killing of George Floyd and the protest and racial injustice issues that have arisen over the past few months, that really was a restart for us and what kicked us back into gear, because we needed to be able to talk as a team. We were showing up, and as Mandy mentioned earlier about having that process in our meetings where we're able to share and talk, and we have that open discussions, and we have that trust amongst each other. Many of us were showing up, but not showing up whole to these meetings, which is very important to understand that, you know, as a Black employee coming into work on after a racial injustice has happened, my mind is definitely not going to be on turning in that report or finishing that project. My mind is focused on what just happened, is focused on the hurt, the pain. So we as employees, if you are truly bringing your whole self to work and you're allowed to do that, you're a feeling person. You're going to come to work and not be thinking about work and have other things on your mind. So I think that that is so important to build that trust part. And we were able to do that. There were many meetings that we joined after these things happened where we kind of tossed out the agenda and we just let everyone share. And that was really important to us. And out of that bred caring conversations. So I was working with a friend of mine on creating some material for their organization, and we were talking about hosting these conversations. Mandy came to me and said, you know, can we formalize instead of just having it in our meetings, can we formalize this? And I said, well, I just happened to be working on something. So I brought the Caring Conversations to SEEA. And what Caring Conversations is just an open, honest group dialogue where we get together for an hour and a half, typically prefaced with some information leading up to that conversation, just to ground the conversation. And we have a discussion, an honest discussion, and people are able to share their experiences. It does bring an opportunity to reflect and understand our feelings and to hear the perspectives of others, which I think is really important, because not everyone's perspective is going to be like yours. And I think that sometimes when you hear another perspective, you're like, oh, I didn't think of it in that way, or I didn't understand how that could have hurt you. And it helps you to really empathize with others and think of things differently. And it has brought our team closer. Not only has it brought our team closer, but I always say that I want to make these conversations, I want to make people get comfortable with being uncomfortable, But you will find, as Mitchell mentioned earlier, the more that you talk about these things and the more that you have these conversations with your teams, you become more comfortable in being able to share and to be able to have these conversations. And we also do have this template that we've offered to some of our other organizations. We created a template to help guide you in those if that's something that you're interested in, and it is an available resource on our website. Upcoming for us, so what's next? What's next for us is staff engagement and training, as I mentioned, to begin in August. So we're going to be doing some diversity dexterity assessments, which will then be followed up by unconscious and implicit bias training, micro and macroaggressions training. Mitchell mentioned earlier those phrases that you use that you don't know offend someone, but absolutely offend someone. We're going to tackle those. And then we're going to talk about diversity as a whole with gender, sexuality, religion, and race and politics. Politics being, with the upcoming election, I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds, but how to do that, how to do it well, and how to be able to be open to conversations about politics when you're on different sides of the party. And understanding how to respect other people's opinions. So we're going to tackle some of those things in our upcoming training. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Wesley Holmes to discuss integrating DI&I into our work and how we were able to do that.
Thanks, Pam. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. So I want to talk a little bit about how does this kind of fit into SEEA's overall organizational strategy? What does it have to do with the issues that we deal with as an organization? And so I want to talk a little bit about our strategic planning process from 2019. So I've been in SEEA since 2012. I led our strategic planning process back in 2016. And during that process, we identified ideas of trust, collaboration, leadership, and equity as being core values for the organization. And I worked on developing these very overloaded, wordy paragraphs that very safely described what those terms meant to us. And when we started revisiting the strategic planning process in 2019 for our new 3-year plan, 3 themes emerged. One, we recognized that those core values were real, that they're still there, we still believed in those things. But we wanted to be more explicit about what those actually meant to us and what it looks like to live those values. We wanted them to be action-oriented, and down to a staff member, it was important for us to raise up our staff-wide recognition of the role of inequity and all of the issues we address. And we wanted to make them publicly known and own them in a way that required us to live into those values and to integrate those into how we think about the issues we address, to how we go about the work we do, and how we get down to the root of diagnosing the problems we're trying to solve. Across the organization, as I'm sure many of you know, we work on transportation, we work on housing, we work on utility regulatory policy and utility program design. And it was important for us to recognize that the issues you find in housing and transportation and income inequality and poverty, these things weren't by accident. The fact that we work across 11 states across the Southeast where these issues are the most pervasive in the nation is not a coincidence. And they have their roots in systemic racism. They have their roots in unjust decision-making, generation upon generation, that leads to dilapidated housing, that leads to a lack of economic opportunity, that leads to being denied loans and access to housing in conscious and unconscious ways. And we wanted to recognize that. So in thinking about how do we do this, how do we take our first steps to doing that, first was articulating our values and articulating how those things are going to show up for us. So in our next slide, I'll share what those values have become. Next slide, Pam. Thank you. So our values we aligned on are take initiative. We take responsibility for realizing a better quality of life in the Southeast. We want to value others. We want to seek, respect, and promote diverse perspectives so we better understand situations. We want to earn trust. We want to pursue our work with benevolence and competence and reliability. And we want to pursue equitable solutions. It's where we want to recognize, acknowledge, and account for a history of prejudice and inequality in Southeastern communities and the role it plays in the issues we address. And those three words at the beginning of that statement are important: recognize, acknowledge, and account for. So we wanted to make it clear that we as a staff see inequity in the spaces we work in. We're aware of it. We want to acknowledge that it's real. It has an effect on people's lives. It has an effect on their health. It has an effect on their mental health. It has an effect on family structure. And it ripples across their lives, and their experiences are real and worth hearing and worth listening to. And then account for. We have to take accountability for that. We as individuals, in whatever power and privilege and opportunity we have, it is incumbent upon us to say something, to do something. To whatever extent we can, we have an obligation to do it. It kind of circles back to our starting value of take initiative. If we see it, it's our obligation to take action on it. Next slide, please. So I want to articulate a little bit about how we're trying to pursue this across the organization. So what you've been hearing to date or throughout this presentation really articulates kind of our diversity, inclusion, integration journey. One way we think of this is that this is doing the kind of cultural work on ourselves, checking our own biases, making sure we're constantly reminding ourselves of the biases that are there and unpacking them, and also supporting others to do that. We know it's a difficult conversation. We know it's a difficult personal journey. And as much as we can support one another to do that, we also want to support our partners in the energy space to do it. Our board member organizations, our member organizations, the partners we're working with in different cities and states across the South. We want to help them to do that work too. And we know it's not easy, and we don't think we have all the answers, but we have been doing a lot of work to try to get started and to try to get moving. And as much as that our lessons can help other people, and as much as Pam and her expertise and training can help others to get on this journey, we want to do that. We want to help shape the culture that informs energy decision making across the South and nationally. But that's just one track. Increasingly, we do talk about our role in the space is to change the way people culturally think about energy and the role it plays in our lives, and also how our culture influences energy. But we also want to do more direct work. There's this Angela Davis quote here: in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist. So one way to think of our work is our diversity, inclusion, integration work is our efforts to be non-racist. But there is work out there to be done that is explicitly anti-racist. All of these generations of inequity, generations of deliberate, intentional racist action, unconscious and conscious prejudice and bias, it seeps into all these, how policies get designed and what policies are and what regulations are. It affects how people are evaluated for creditworthiness. It affects how people decide where power plants go, where pipelines go, where coal ash ponds go. It affects how people decide what communities are worth investing in, what communities are safe bets to invest in, are credit worthy for an investment in electric vehicle chargers or investments in energy efficiency and healthy quality housing. It's in there. We know it's in there. We don't have the answers for where it is, but we want to find them. We want to figure out our role in breaking those down. So on the right side of the screen, what we've got is a descriptor on what we're trying to do to find barriers to equity in the system. And that's our effort to identify those policy and regulatory elements that manifest in equity in terms of energy burden, environmental justice, and economic opportunity. We want to know what are the sources of that, what kind of policy language allows bias, unconscious or otherwise, to limit opportunities for people in the South, and what can we do to reshape that? What can we do to change the language in our policy making? What can we do to change the makeup of who makes policies so that they have diverse perspectives on how those things ripple across the community? Currently, our work area teams, our transportation team, our policy team, our built environment team, and really all elements of our organization are all looking at how do these issues touch my work? How do they touch my area of expertise? And what can I do? And what's appropriate and in line with SEEA's role in the space, and how we approach our work for us to engage on that and try to make some difference there. So that's in progress. You know, we've done a lot of work on our DII strategy to date, as you've seen us outline, but we're still in the early phases of figuring out what can we do and what should we do in regulatory policy, in housing policy, in code enforcement, in transportation investment. So we're working on those policies right now, and we do intend to, as we find those issues and diagnose those issues and understand our role better to engage there, we're going to be looking to do an addendum and an update to our current strategic plan, which was just released last month. That's going to articulate that more clearly. We want to make it public, and we want to own it. So I think you can look to expect that from us going forward. So I'll stop there. I recognize we're 5 minutes after 11, and we want to make sure that there's some time for Q&A with our audience. So just to recap our journey so far, in terms of what we've done, one, we have to develop a culture of trust. Mandy was a champion for that throughout the organization, of getting us to see the other human beings in our office, not just the other functions in our office, and to understand the layers of people is really important. And that's incredibly important to the foundation of being able to have hard conversations about beliefs and prejudices and biases. It's really important. Getting your board to buy in and commit at a board level, and to make the same kind of space for them to be open and honest with one another, and get them bought into the collective vision. As members of our organization, they need to be bought into our collective vision on this issue. Then set a plan for diversity, inclusion, integration, and commit resources to it. It's not enough to pay lip service to it. You got to commit money to it. You got to commit budget to it. You got to commit time to it. And four, integrate those values across the work. It can't be something that lives over here and your work is something separate. It's got to be integrated throughout your work. And so that's where we're at right now, is trying to figure out how we integrate it throughout our work. So with that, I'll turn it back to Pam. I think we're going to invite questions from folks. Pam, do you have the question box available on your presenter screen? I don't have that on mine.
I do. I am on. I don't see any questions that are pulled up at the moment. So if anyone has any questions, if you could type your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, we'll read them and direct them to the appropriate speaker. If you have a specific person that you want to, so if you have a specific person you want to address your question to, please add that there. I have something that says lessons learned. So I would probably address that to all of you through this journey. Like, what are some of the lessons that you have learned?
I think the most important thing is how important it is to go out and seek people out. Going back to John's conversation about the board, the staff had to, over the course of the year, be actively looking for partners we already had and approaching them about saying, you know, these are our goals. You're a leader in this field for all these reasons. Please join us in this journey to get more gender and racial diversity on this board. And I serve on a number of boards and lead a number of governance committees for boards. And I think so often we just use, we set goals, but then we don't stand in the hard conversation and really call people to join us. And I think that it's absolutely critical that we name this stuff and just be very explicit about it.
What about you, John?
I can't emphasize that enough, especially as a white man. I mean, I really look back at even my adult life and to kind of borrow a bad cliche, you know, I was kind of, but I was that, but I have a black friend crowd. I was like, well, I can't, clearly I'm doing my part. And I absolutely wasn't. It really required me to step back and be honest about my surroundings and my role in getting to those surroundings, that I had not done the work, both on myself and in growing my community. And so that intention of get out of the network I'm in and grow it and expand it and seek out others to bring in to that network, to connect networks that I had not put the effort into doing before. I think that's really, really important. I mean, as I said, the one key thing I've taken back to my company is in having done diversity policies with previous companies that I've worked in, they were often about just making sure doors aren't closed, right? Do we have the right language? You know, does the job description, is it clean and clear, as opposed to let's actually actively open doors now and then hold them open and go find people and say, please come in.
I agree. And just to add to that point, John, as I'm speaking to a lot of organizations in particular, some boards, they speak of diversity as an affirmative action move. The affirmative action is still in a lot of people's minds, like we have to have this percentage or this number of in order to make it equitable. But it's really about bringing in cognitive thought into your organization. It's not about making a number. So I'm glad you brought that point up. Mitchell?
That's a hard question. I would say that I think I learned that there could exist in a professional setting a commitment from people to make space for these sort of conversations. Because as you mentioned, Pam, when things happen that affect some of us who are categorized as minorities, like some of the racial injustice issues that we've had, like you said, Pam, you may show up to work and you're still affected by that. And having a space, I think that when folks make a space for you to share that has been really helpful. And I think as we've gone through this process at SEEA, it certainly, I think, one, illuminated that there are folks willing to have the conversations. And I think, two, it just encouraged me to be more vocal or open to sort of sharing my opinions about sort of what's happening, and sort of coming back and talking to my organization here about how can we work to address, or at least start the conversation to address some of those disparate impacts that may fall upon minorities and other people. So I'll just pause there.
Okay, we have another question here. Do you have any key metrics for what DI&I will look like when it's integrated into SEEA's programs? I think, Wesley, you might be a good one to address that.
So the answer is right now, no, we don't have specific metrics. We have a goal to develop metrics. It's hard to put numbers around the kind of work we do and getting people to change culture and change attitudes. So one of the ways we have to think about is, a specific policy shifting, greater participation, greater access to programs in specific communities, more contractors and businesses run by people of color and women getting job opportunities in the space. I mean, it's subtle, anecdotal kind of ways that you have to measure how a culture is shifting. So it's not clear. I don't have a clear answer to that. I think it's a little art and a little science, and we're still trying to figure out what the right benchmarks are. And one of the ways we measure it is kind of by the conversations we have with external stakeholders and with ourselves, and understand how attitudes are shifting and ideas are shifting and evolving. And that's what we track. That's what we work on.
I'd add to that too, Wesley. So I know for me with membership, some of the ways that I am tracking is through supplier diversity. So ensuring that we are getting diverse members that are diverse suppliers within our membership. Also, I've been looking at workforce. Workforce is something that we actually tackled during our our 2019 conference, actually 2018 and 2019, where we specifically looked for diverse students that were scholarshiped to attend our conference. So bringing in, and we reached out to HBCUs as well as other universities, but really focusing in on diverse applicants to be able to attend our conference. Those are a couple of ways that that we are also looking at metrics and how we measure effectiveness. I have another question here. Please address.
And Pam, before you go on,
Sure.
I'm sorry, can I say something?
Sure.
I think that we as individuals also have to have metrics for our own life and how we want to manifest this. And I myself challenge myself to do one thing a day that is hard and uncomfortable in support of racial equity, because I think that if I can do that, then I'm building my muscles, and it has been yielding good fruit. New and fun things result in my life. It's helped me grow my friendships. It's helped me grow my relationships in professionally. It's deepened my relationships with my colleagues. And as we go deeper and are able to have more robust conversations one-on-one with this, I'm finding that we can also generate new solutions that we wouldn't have ever thought about even 6 months ago. So I think that I challenge people to not just get lost in the metrics of the organization, but we as people, we each need to be figuring out for ourselves how we're going to do this hard work.
Thank you, Mandy. Another question from the audience is, please address the explicit and implicit resistance that the organization experienced in this journey. Mandy, you want to speak to that?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is when we started the board conversation, and we just started feeling around about what the topic should be, it was uncomfortable. It was the kind of uncomfortableness that white people don't know how to talk about these things. We are very genteel, so we use coded language, and we don't want to offend anyone or be PC. So we have this way we talk about diversity, and that I could really sense the energy in the boardroom when we started this, and to me that was like, okay, that just means we need to talk about it more. This just needs to become normal. And so we started reporting about it and talking about it, and Steve Leeds, our former board chair, it was just routine in the board meetings, and that took away a lot of the weirdness that was just there around it, and it just became a normal part of the conversation, and that helped a lot for us to have more and more transparent and honest conversations. In terms of the staff, Pam has been amazing at bringing these new ways to address this, bringing a vision to us that we really needed as an organization, and calling things out. Like this year, for instance, she said, we don't have a budget for diversity, inclusion, and integration work. We haven't made that explicit. And I'm like, you are so right. That is a complete miss on our part. And so now that we're recasting the budget, because we do that twice a year, it's like, yeah, this is a hard year, but we've got to have a part of the budget for that. So it's done a world of good for this organization to have her leading and managing this. And I often think about the world of sustainability. Before I came to SEEA, I was the sustainability director for the city of Atlanta, the first one. And just like on the sustainability front, we know that you've got to have a director of sustainability to get a corporation or government to really lead and manage the environmental sustainability of said group. It's the exact same thing on this work around racial justice. And as another analogy that we've been playing with is, we do a lot of work around Earth Day to figure out how we as individuals can be more environmentally conscious, and we have a competition about that. The same thing is true for work in racial justice, because it's about creating a whole new system and way of being. And we can only do that. Will happen gradually. That will happen in joyful, like if we can find ways that are joyful and nurture our soul. And Pam radiates joy. She loves this. She's open, she's welcoming. And so that has been such an amazing way to model for each of us, myself included, like to go deeper, to do harder, because it's so freeing and life-giving.
And I think to your point in that, for we as people of color have to add to how we can help in this, we have to make it okay for you guys to be able to talk to us about it. Like, we have to give that permission, because without us really inviting you into the conversation, it's very hard for white people to have these conversations, or people of any race to have these conversations. It's very difficult. So inviting you into a space to where you feel comfortable enough to be able to have those conversations is really important. We have about 5 more minutes of questioning left, and I do have a question here, but John and Mitchell, did either of you have anything to add to that? Or okay, I think so. All right, so the next question was about timeline. How long has it taken SEEA to get to this point?
I came to SEEA about 10 years ago. And we've been marching down the journey. And I also think it's a new moment in time. Yeah, the things that were cool to talk about, like not cool, but okay and acceptable to talk about collectively, like the collective conscience 6 months ago, a year ago, it's a new day. Society has changed. Society has shifted. There is a need and a desire in the world to talk about this more, do the work on self, do the work on organization in a way that's never existed before. And so I think that it's the amount of time it's taken us doesn't need to take other groups that long. And I also think I've seen that the work we're doing has accelerated because of the change in the collective conscience of society.
Agreed. And part of that question was also about the key steps and how long it takes to get through the phases. As I mentioned earlier, it's been fluid for us. I thought that we would move through it a lot quicker than we have. I would have loved to move through it a little bit quicker than we have, but that first phase is so important in ensuring that you get that part right. And it may take some people longer than others, especially if you don't have someone leading this work in your organization. It may take you a little bit longer to get there. So you have to give yourself some grace and understanding that this is a journey. It is not a race. It is a journey. As long as you begin the journey is really the important part of it. Another question is that what can an individual do or someone in an organization do to address DI&I when there may not be support or attention from leadership?
That is the perennial challenge, right? We see that on energy efficiency too. If somebody doesn't want to weatherize their facility and the CFO doesn't agree with it, or somebody wants to weatherize and the CFO doesn't agree with it, budget's not going to be made available. Same thing on these issues we're talking about now. And I think that that's where the self part is so important. Doing things that bring you joy and nurture your soul and doing something every day, you will, and then seeking out people within your community to do them with, and adding more people, calling others on this journey with you, that will make a difference. And also in parallel to that, I think we have a duty to speak up when we see injustice. I, in a previous life, have suffered from, gender discrimination, and I spoke up about it, and it was one of the scariest and hardest things I've done, but it was one of the absolute most important things in my career, and for myself, for my own integrity. And I think that is the same on these issues. Like, and we white people have a duty to provide support and political will as our friends and colleagues of color take the courage to stand up and say, this happened to me.
Mandy, I'll echo that and just sort of jump in. Like you mentioned, if you're in an organization that doesn't support that, I think it does start with a self journey. And maybe that journey starts with small steps. Maybe it's just reaching out and talking to one of your peers that you don't normally talk to who's different from you. And as you continue to do those smaller, more incremental steps, you build the muscle, right? You build the strength, you build the bravery in order to progress up to the more or the larger sort of situations, to where maybe you build up the nerve to confront an injustice directly, as Mandy mentioned. But start small. If your organization doesn't support it, start small and try to grow it from there.
You can always influence where you are. We only have 2 more questions left, and they're really good. So I really want to get, I want to squeeze these 2 in. How long did it take for the board to get over the weirdness? And how was the topic of privilege discussed or handled?
It took us about, we meet 4 times a year, plus, like I said, we meet 5 times a year, including budget approval. I think after we did a year cycle, the energy seemed to dissipate. And by the next all board retreat that we have those every January, it really was, the energy had changed. In terms of discussing privilege, the staff, we are really just very frank and honest with each other about it and speak in very plain terms. So it's a thing we just talk about and have been talking about.
And the other question, the last one, was about meeting design. How do you, I'm sorry, I lost it. It's about creating trust. How do you encourage participation and earn trust?
Wesley, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Yeah, for me, it's a big part was council process. So where you actually create a structure where the expectation is everybody's going to share something. So that creates a space for introverts to know that they're going to have an opportunity to say something. You got to create a structure that allows for extroverts to say what they're going to say, but also not dominate the conversation and leave room for introverts who want to have something to say, and it could be important. That's a big part. And getting people to listen and be patient and understand that feelings matter. It was a long growth edge for me to understand in thinking about business, that how my colleagues felt about what we were doing was as important as what we were doing. And so it is just a formalized structure that says everybody's got a voice, and you need to respect when it's time for you to be quiet and listen, and when it's time for you to say something. And not letting individuals necessarily control the agenda, but rather working to a formatted kind of standard approach to an agenda that is consistent, so that the process guides the conversation rather than the person who has the loudest voice in the room guiding the conversation. I think that's a big part of it.
I think that's perfect, Wesley. And a great way to end our session is 11:29. And if you have any questions, or if you have any additional questions for us, please reach out to Mandy or myself. We're happy to help you to think about your diversity journey or answer any of your questions about the webinar or the organization. And we also have some resources on our webpage, sealliance.org/diversity. And with that, we will conclude our session, and thank you all for attending. We appreciate it, and reach out to us for any questions.